horror is all about analogy and
I'm not seeing. Okay, this is the thing.
Metaphor, and that I think that conversation that, you know, in the way that I think that this movie lets all of its facets kind of give the full picture. The fact that this movie is called Hereditary.
Right.
And that's not like a word that's really used in the film, but is a word that gives you another angle on the idea that is being presented here.
Right.
And I think that alone is interesting, and that the kind of the allegory of the families that have battled with mental illness often feel, or that it can feel like a curse or a thing that maybe you don't even have control over. I mean, there's even weird, you know, there's arguments about alcoholism where you realize that like the biology that people are discovering more and more, that like the biology of your gut, the way you process food and the way you crave food is something that is inherited.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that people would be prone to alcoholism, it's like, oh, that's like literally an inherited thing. Yep. And that allegory of that it can feel like a curse, I think is interesting. And that's nothing against the real battles that people go against in mental health, and the incredible amounts of agency that people are able to show over mental illness and struggles that they've had, that because people are able to show so much strength and so much agency in controlling those things. But at your worst, you can sometimes feel like it's this thing that you just didn't even get a fucking say in.
Once again, I love what you are able to extract. I did not extract those ideas, but and the reason why is because I think, but I do want to say, like, I think that what you're saying first is a valid opinion, and I'm sure that's how a lot of people view and enjoy this movie. I just personally didn't kind of view it that way.
Right, of course.
I think all this movie, to me, has that is interesting is an allegory and an analogy. Unfortunately, I also need it to be a good horror movie. And it's something that I think is a trend that I'm going to say is not necessarily just something that A24 is doing, but there's this interesting trend of quote unquote horror movies coming out that I just look at and I'm like, who like thought that telling and marketing people, like marketing this as a horror movie is a good idea? And like I would put Lighthouse in that category, and I would also put a movie that I haven't seen, but A24's movie Lamb
looks just like it's right up that alley.
Looks like nothing but an analogy that might feel uncomfortable at moments, but I'm like, that's not a fucking horror movie. Why are you advertising it like a horror movie?
Well,
I guess maybe they're advertising it like a Michael Haneke movie, but I don't know.
Sure, but which is able to incorporate a lot of genres.
Yeah, speaking of
and
funny
I think
games.
that's a thing. But I also think that we're also now, there's a new generation of filmmaker, people who were raised on certain types of digital cameras, the way that you think about the absolute reliance on like the dark tones of the people kind of fading into the dark corners of this movie, and how they almost kind of look like the kind of white blue splotch that you see when your eye looks in a dark spot.
Sort of at the end when they're in the woods and stuff, you mean, right?
Yeah. That or just even the guys in the doorways at the end of Hereditary, or up in the attic and stuff. And that I think I don't know. I mean, the way that this movie is shot, the way that something like The Lighthouse or something like The Witch is shot.
That Witch is terrifying.
It reminds me of the way that like guys who we went to college with, who were cinematographers, who were like learning in the modern era of like digital cinematography and finding their ways of kind of referencing a lot of classical things while still trying to find a new modern take on it. And people who love the trappings of horror but don't want to go into kind of all of the lazy, easy way that people do horror. So they're going to say, I'm going to take a certain type of genre and kind of lay a horror third act or a horror tone over it that maybe doesn't need to be 100% a horror movie. And that I like the 15 or 20 minutes of straight up horror movie I get out of this movie, and I don't need the whole movie to be it, because I think that it's successfully doing other things, and I know that it's failing for you on those things. So I buy that totally. But I guess but unfortunately, the point that I was getting to was that unfortunately there has been, as you're saying, this new conversation around those types of movies. And I hate even using the term, but there's been this conversation around what people call like elevated horror movies, which is a term that frustrates me because I think that
I don't know.
Well, that's the thing. What the fuck does that mean? And that they've said that like Hereditary is elevated horror when people were kind of like marketing Toni Collette to try to get an Oscar nomination, which I love her in this movie. I don't even think she really should have been like in the Oscar conversation because it's a different type of performance.
Yeah, but it is a pretty I do think the performance of the main character. I'm sorry, just to stop you real quick. I think the main performance of the actress in Babadook definitely deserved an Oscar nomination, and I think on that same level, I think Toni Collette at least deserved the nomination.
If she had, I would have been like, "That's dope." Yeah. I just wasn't expecting her to get one. You're saying. You know what I mean? A lot of people were like, "That was a snub," and I'm like, did you guys see Hereditary? I'm not surprised they didn't nominate her. It's a lot, and I love it, and I probably would put her in my top 5 performances of that year. But like, who thought she was getting an Oscar nomination?
Yeah,
and
continue about the genre.
And I think that. But that genre of what people are calling elevated horror, which I think is just kind of this bullshit, way of just going like horror movies that are good or that are really accomplishly like not B film, like A film budget treated like a respectable, like, when people were talking about Get Out, they were calling it an elevated horror movie because for some reason they thought that just calling it a horror movie was somehow implying it was bad. Yeah. It's like implying
but also,
it's like implying somebody is a bad person because they're poor. It's no, those things aren't.
I mean, on some level, like Get Out is focusing much more on the direct sort of like idea of someone invading your mind and taking over your body, which is terrifying.
A thrillery horror movie,
yeah. And I mean, I would argue that Hereditary doesn't really even focus on the idea of something taking over your body until really closer to the end. It's mostly just focused on the tragedy. Like Get Out is very much the entire time. Like I think that movie is a great horror movie because the entire time the thing that is terrifying you is there and it's present. And I think that, I honestly hadn't heard that term elevated horror, and I think that's I also think that's bullshit if that is a terminology, because I think that you can exist,
a good movie is a good movie.
You can exist in that drag me to hell style of like every minute you're probably getting something that's going to make you jump or like sort of like disturb you in some way. But I also think that, and we talked about it, I'm just going to say the title, The Shining. You also have a movie like The Shining, which
what's that?
Similarly to Hereditary. It's this movie, some guy wrote it. The Shining, like Hereditary. I think The Shining is probably 30 minutes longer than Hereditary, but like Hereditary, it kind of takes a long time to build to that place.